So Oliver, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk to you about your life and career. So you're a distinguished member of a remarkable intellectual family. Could you tell us a bit about your family and your upbringing?
My family, well, my maternal grandfather was a professor of physiology at Sheffield University and a fellow of the Royal Society. And my father, Oliver Penrose, he was a geneticist, and he was also a fellow of the Royal Society, and he was the professor of human genetics at University College London for quite a long time, like 20 years. One of the, I think, first scientists to work on human genetics as opposed to plant and animal genetics. And I've got two brothers, Roger Penrose, who's very famous, as you probably know. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society and Order of Merit or something like that. And he's very well known for his books on cosmology and black holes and things. And another brother, my other brother, Jonathan, is a very good chess player. He was British chess champion 10 times, I think, including 7 times in a row. And my sister, Shirley, who's quite a bit younger, she's 16 years younger than me. And she is a medical geneticist and a co-author of a book about the genetics of cancer. So those are my immediate relatives, and my uncle Roland is one of the most famous of all, of course, because of his connection with surrealist art and having been a great friend of Picasso. And his wife, Lee Miller, is very well known as a photographer, or was, that is to say, especially after her death. I think that's about all of them.
So you mentioned that your younger brother was a very fine chess player, but you're also a very good chess player, as I know to my cost.
Oh.
And your father was a good chess player too.
And a chess problemist. He was a very good chess problemist. Well, I think that's one of the ways to become good at chess, is to have a brother who is also good at chess. Then you compete with each other. And that was what we did when we were in our teens. As I was older than him, for a while I was better. I went to the library and read all the chess books in the library, but he wasn't into reading books or using the library so much. But when I was about 16 and he was 12, he became better than me. And since then he's always been a very strong player, as he was noted for winning a game against the then world champion Tal. I think Jonathan is a grand master now, sort of retrospectively. No, he doesn't play chess anymore now. It's too stressful.
You told me a nice story about Bob Wade, who stayed in your house.
Ah, Bob Wade, yes. Well, I met him at some chess tournament, and because of a very good game, a very brilliant game that he had played, I knew about him, and he and I arranged that he would come around to our house where the family lived in Golders Green for the evening. So he came around to the evening and showed us books of pictures about New Zealand and things where he came from. I think he had just arrived from New Zealand or something. Anyway, Bob Wade ended up staying at the house for a long time, of the order of a year. I think my father wanted him to stay because he would help Jonathan with his chess. On the other hand, my mother wasn't so keen because it was extra work for her, and so on one occasion I think she tried to throw him out by moving his suitcase outside the front door. But when my father returned, he found this suitcase and brought it back inside. So Bob Wade stayed for a while. But he did a lot later on, training British junior chess players, and he is probably the reason why there was such a good English chess team in the, I don't know when it was, around 1990 or something.
Now your father's research was mathematical in genetics in some sense? Is that where the mathematics in the family came from, among the brothers anyway?
Well, my father must have been interested in mathematics from an early age, because he told me that when he was asked what he wanted for his birthday, and he said he wanted Chambers' 7-figure logarithms so that he could do calculations multiplying numbers together and get the answer exactly right. And so he was certainly interested in mathematics and very interested in mathematical puzzles as well. And as I said, chess problems. And when he started doing research into human genetics, he found a very clever statistical method of sorting out the effect of age on children with the condition which is now called Down syndrome. He showed that the age of the mother was very important. If the mother was elderly, it wasn't good news for the child, but the father's age had no effect at all. So he did a very good statistical analysis on that, and he did a lot of other statistical analysis on mental defect as well, showing that, in effect, that there were two different things going on. Some people had hereditary conditions, and in other cases it just was that they just turned out not to be very intelligent, as more or less accidentally.
And was there a lot of scientific discussion in the family about various things?
I don't think it was so scientific, but there was quite a lot of discussion about puzzles. I seem to remember we were interested in spaceships, for example. If my mother gave us hard-boiled eggs for a meal, we would call them spaceships and move them around like that. And I think it must have been my father who produced this little puzzle that you know that the numbers 2 plus 2 is the same as 2 times 2. But he said, was there any other pair of numbers which the same property? And Roger and I got very interested in this puzzle. I think this started us off somehow. And then later on he taught me some calculus when I was still at school, and I think he taught Roger calculus when he got to that stage, or got ready for it.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to school?
I spent most of my time at school in London, Canada. It was during the war, and the whole family was living in London, Canada for the duration. And I was at a school called the London Central Collegiate Institute, which, on recollection, I now feel was a very good school. I felt they gave me a very good education in chemistry and physics and mathematics. Not so good in English, perhaps. I never warmed to English as a school subject. Roger also went to that school, but only spent a year there. I was 2 years younger than most of the children in my class, because when we got to Canada, they gave me tests and things and decided that was the level I should go into. Before I went to Canada, I was for a couple of terms in a boarding school from which the main thing I learned was never to send my own children to a boarding school. But fortunately for me, I didn't have to go to boarding school in Canada because my parents couldn't afford it.
So
although they talked about it, yes.
So after the war ended, you came back and you went to University College.
I did. I came back. I'd finished the school system there, and my father got this house in Golders Green where we moved into, and I started at University College. I wanted to do physics, but I hadn't reached the necessary level to start the university course at University College. So I took a course called Intermediate. I don't think it exists anymore, but it was equivalent to the last year or two of school. And then I started on the physics degree at University College, which took 3 years.
Did you enjoy university?
University College, yes, I did, yes. I enjoyed learning the physics. I wasn't very good at experimental physics. In fact, I regret to say that I cooked a lot of my experimental results. That is to say, I didn't do the experiments properly and wrote down afterwards what I thought the results should have been.
Yes.
Putting in some errors. Occasionally my invented error of measurement was rather large, and the person who marked this thing said, what an enormous error, or something. Anyway.
And then you went to Cambridge to do your PhD.
I then went to Cambridge, yes, which was very lucky for me, I think. I had various lucky events around that time.
And who did you go to work with?
I was supervised by Temperley, HNV Temperley, who died recently at the age of 102. And but he didn't know me from Adam when I went there. I think what happened was that my mother wrote to Professor Hartree, whom she had known when she was at school at Bedales. And he said, come up and see me. So I went up to see him, and I told him what I would like to work on. He told me various alternatives, and I said I would like to do statistical mechanics. And he said, our statistical mechanics person is Temperley, and he picked up the phone, telephoned Temperley at King's College, and Temperley then came round to Hartree's office. I must be misremembering this, but and he seemed very happy to take me on, even though he had hardly spoken to me. He said, well, I think it's considered all right to have not more than 8 research students, or something to that. So he very kindly took me on and said, you'd better read some mathematics. So I started reading, was it Whitaker and Watson, I think, on modern analysis, which I didn't get on with very well. So I found a nice book called Copson's Theory of Complex Variable, which was very good indeed, I thought. And I was also reading Courant and Hilbert, Methods of Mathematical Physics, which may have been in German. I think the English translation came out around then. Anyway, I spent the first term, or the first year, reading that stuff. So Temperley's advice was very good. He had told me to read lots of mathematics, having this physics degree.
And you went to courses and...
Well, I went to 2 courses that I thought were extremely good. One was by Herman Bondi on, well, I guess it was analytic functions and things like that. And the other one was Dirac on what he called the Principles of Quantum Mechanics, his book. which I thought was a wonderful book and a wonderful course. Some physicists don't like it because it's too formal, I think, and mathematicians don't like it because he doesn't do the rigorous mathematics at all rigorously, but I thought it was great, his way of doing things. And one of the papers I wrote when I was there was very much based on what Dirac had told us about the harmonic oscillator. And my idea was to apply that to sound waves, which I did, although...
So what was your thesis on?
Well, it was about liquid helium. They had the Royal Society Monde laboratory was very close to where my office was. That was a low-temperature physics laboratory, which had been set up because of this Russian low-temperature physicist, Peter Kapitsa. And they set up this laboratory. I suppose Mr. Monde must have given them a lot of money. And then Kapitsa went back to Russia on a visit, and Stalin wouldn't let him out again. So there was this nice laboratory, but they needed to find some brilliant people to put in it. But anyway, it was a good place for me because it gave me some contact with experimental physics, which I needed as a theorist, and got me interested in this liquid helium superfluidity, which was a new and some new thing that wasn't very well understood at that time.
And was your thesis directly connected to experiments that were going on in this lab, or?
Well, it was to do with the theory of superconductivity. I didn't mention any. Well, I may have mentioned some of the experiments, but the people were understanding roughly that you could understand these experimental results in terms of a two-fluid theory in which the helium, when it was below its transition, below this transition about at 2 degrees Kelvin, it would behave like two interpenetrating fluids, which is quite unheard of before that. And one of them was a superfluid, that's to say it could move without friction. So this was something to try and understand theoretically. That was what I was writing my thesis about. I had there were about 6 research students in one room in the Cavendish laboratory, which at that time was in the middle of Cambridge, not on the outskirts as it is now. And we were in the room where I think Lord Rayleigh measured exactly the strength of the standard ampere or something like that. Some very important experiment. There were 6 of us, and one of them was Aaron Klug, who later turned out to be the president of the Royal Society and won the Nobel Prize, and another one was Dennis Sharma, who was also in the Royal Society, and another chap called Peter Price, who went to America, and he was very interested in this liquid helium problem too. And we used to talk about it a lot, talk about how to understand the Schrödinger equation for 10 to the 23 particle system. So his thesis was about that sort of thing, and so was mine.
And during your time at Cambridge, Lars Onsager, who comes later in your story,
yes,
visited.
Well, that was another of the lucky things. He just happened to show up during my 3rd year, and he had come to this Monde laboratory, and he had wanted to had some ideas about superconductivity. I think it was the de Haas-Van Alphen effect, which I've forgotten what that is now, but anyway. He published a paper about that, which was very original. But I talked to him a bit, and I showed him what I'd been doing, and he was interested. So a few years later, when I was trying to get an academic position, I wrote to him and said, would he write me a reference? And he very kindly wrote and said, would I like to be his research assistant? He was going to apply for some money to appoint a research assistant, which he did. So that led to me going to Yale University and working with him for a year, which was a great privilege.
So between that year in Yale and leaving Cambridge, you spent 3 years doing secret work for English Electric.
I was working for the English Electric Company, yes.
So you didn't have to do national. That was your national service. In some
It
sense.
was. Well, I don't know if I was deferred. I was deferred from national service because I was doing work of national importance, and that was mathematical physics. But after 3 years, I reached the age of 26, at which I was no longer liable for military service, so I could go away without getting conscripted. So I was able to take up this position at Yale University.
And the 3 years you spent at English Electric, I mean, did what you did have any positive effect on what you did later in your career, or
I got married? That had an effect. What else? Well, I don't think the work I did there had much effect, no, except I found out how bad I was at doing certain types of engineering problems. No, I think it was a complete change of direction when I went to Yale University.
And tell us about your wife.
Well, I met her at a concert. I wanted to play the cello in some group, and there was this group called the Luton Youth. This was in Luton, I should have said, this English Electric place. So I joined this orchestra, and they had a concert, which I played the cello in. And there I met Joan, who was a violinist. She had already left Luton by that time. She was studying at the Royal Academy of Music, living in London, but she had come up to help them out with this concert. She used to be their leader, I think, when she was living in Luton, when she was still at school.
Your work with Onsager, what was this that you did in
Well,
Yale?
that was connected with this liquid helium problem, and because, well, there had been the theory that had been proposed about liquid helium. There were two theories, in fact. One by Landau in Russia, involving sound waves, quantized sound waves, and the analogous thing to photons for sound was called phonons, which is a quantum of sound. And his theory was based on phonons and how they bounced around, and that the phonon, you could have a gas of phonons whose mass motion was different from the speed of the fluid it was in. That was how these two fluids came about, according to him. And then there was a rival theory, which had been started by Fritz London and Laszlo Tisza, if I'm pronouncing his name right, which was based on this Bose-Einstein condensation, which happens in an ideal gas, that if you cool an ideal gas of Bose particles below a certain temperature, a finite fraction of the particles will go into the lowest possible state. And so this had, again, you had two fluids, these condensed particles and the rest, making two different bits which could perhaps flow past each other. So it was difficult to understand why there were these two theories, and also how could this Bose-Einstein condensation happen in a system of interacting particles, because it was only understood in a gas. So what I was doing was proposing that how a way of having Bose-Einstein condensation in a system of interacting particles, and I wrote a paper about that, which was my first publication. I talked about its possible hydrodynamic implications. And then when I got to Yale, Onsager said, well, this is very interesting. What you're talking about is the largest eigenvalue of the one-body reduced density matrix. I don't know if I can explain to you what that is without a piece of paper or a blackboard or something. But the one-body reduced density matrix is a quantum mechanical description of what happens to one particle. It's rather like what you have in a, say, a classical gas, that you can talk about how many particles there are with a given velocity, and how many what the density of particles at a particular place with a particular velocity. So this is a function of position and velocity, which is called the one-body distribution function. Is that what you're used to calling it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, this is the quantum mechanical analog of that thing. And it's a matrix or operator. And Onsager pointed out that the largest eigenvalue of this operator could be macroscopic, I think he called it, which meant that it was a finite fraction of the total number of particles. And this happened in the model that I had suggested to generalize London's theory. So we put that into a paper which was published in 1956, which, well, I like that because that paper has been cited more often than anything else I wrote.
And in Yale you met Joel Lebowitz, is that right?
I did, because Onsager had 2 years of research grant, and I didn't want to use the second year. I think he would have liked me to do that, but by that time I had a job lined up at Imperial College, London. I wanted to go back to England, or like as an academic post anyway. So I wanted to do that, and he had a year research associateship going. So he offered it to Joel Lebowitz, who had been recommended to him by Peter Bergman, I think. So I got to know Joel Lebowitz at that time, because he used to come up to Yale to see Onsager before he actually started the fellowship.
And was that where you started working together, or was that later?
We didn't do anything together at that time, no, but a few years later, he invited me to spend a year at, I think I've got this right. He had by that time had finished with Onsager, and he went to work at Yeshiva University in New York City, which was, as you can tell from the name, it was a Jewish university. The place where you ate was kosher, for example, and so he invited me to work a year there, by which time we had one little daughter, 2 years old, Rebecca, and my second child, Rebecca's brother, older, was Matthew. He was born in New York City, so he had British nationality and American, which was very nice for him. And in that year we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was very exciting. And I resolved I would write 3 papers, and I actually did write 3 papers during that time. either one or two in collaboration with Lebowitz, which was on classical fluid and classical fluid systems at low density. So I got working more on classical statistical mechanics then, and a bit less quantum. When I was at Imperial, they were interested in high temperature physics. Blackett was the professor there, and they wanted to understand high temperature physics because of the possibility of making energy by fusion reactions like the ones in the sun. People were saying it would take 20 years to get this project to work, and now, I mean, how long is it? 60 or 70 years, and it still isn't working, but we hope it will get to work soon and then solve all our energy problems, which will be great. But anyway, I found the high temperature physics didn't seem to suit me somehow. It was too complicated. And so I started working on the more on the classical statistical mechanics. I can't remember all that well what I was doing at that time.
But the work you did with Lebowitz on sort of metastability for...
Yeah, we had a paper about... Well, we had what I think was a very good paper about the equilibrium statistical mechanics leading to van der Waals' equation, which is an approximate equation of state for a gas, which predicts the liquid-vapor transition. Gives a nice explanation of the liquid-vapor transition, but this equation of state had not been derived from any molecular model. I should say the equation of state is a formula that tells you what the pressure of the gas is if you know its temperature and density. So van der Waals came up with an empirical formula which did this, or more or less empirical, with some theoretical basis. And Lebowitz and I were able to find a model, that's to say, assumptions about the forces between the molecules, which would lead to van der Waals' equation, or a similar one with that. So I liked that because I think it was the first statistical mechanics model in 3 dimensions that gave a phase transition, although not as good as Onsager's 2-dimensional solution of the Ising model, which was a great tour de force. But I didn't have any didn't do any serious work on that.
So I think that I got to know you because of this. I went to some meeting maybe that you organised at the Open University, and I think that you told me about this metastability issue, which at some point you reassured me that it was okay to have non-convex equations of state, even though...
Yes, well, the free energy, according to a general theorem of statistical mechanics, the free energy should be a convex function of the temperature, I think, if your listeners know what free energy means.
Or density.
And it's not, in which case you just get a strict phase transition. That's to say, as you change the temperature at a given density, the material will suddenly go from solid to liquid. It will start to form droplets of liquid, and they will gradually take over the whole material. But experimentally, you get metastable states in which the liquid doesn't form, which happens, for example, when it gets cool at night. The the moisture in the air may be at a temperature where it should form a liquid, but in fact it doesn't form a liquid, except maybe little droplets on the leaves and things, because it takes some energy to form a droplet of liquid, which is not provided by the cooling effect. So if it stays in this superheated vapor form, that's called a metastable state, and it depends on the surface tension of droplets and further, rather more complicated effects than van der Waals equation contains. So Lebowitz and I produced a theory of metastable states in this same model that we had talked about, which led to the van der Waals equation of state. I'm not as happy about that piece of work as I am about the equilibrium thermodynamics, but anyway, metastability is a complex subject, so it's more difficult to produce rigorous results about it.
So how long did you spend at Imperial altogether?
Well, that was 13 years, I think.
13 years. And then you made a very interesting move to the Open University. How did this come about?
How did it come about? Well, one of my students applied for a job. The Open University was just starting up at that time. And one of my students, they were advertising for jobs for mathematicians, I guess. They had 4 faculties at that time. Science, mathematics, social science, and arts. So it was a wonderful thing for mathematics to be a quarter of the whole university instead of whatever small fraction it is in most places. And so this ex-student, or just about to graduate student of mine, applied for this job. And so the people running the university at that time, which was just Walter Perry, the vice-chancellor, and Christodoulou, the secretary, and maybe 1 or 2 other people, they wrote to me and sent me some information about it. So I read that and I thought, this looks interesting. I'd like to be involved with that. So I let them know when I wrote this chap's the report about my student. And so then somebody rang me up and said, well, it was Maxim Bruckheimer, the dean of mathematics faculty, who had been appointed. He said, we're interviewing for professors of mathematics today. Would you like to come along? So I went along. And so they made me one of the 2 professors of mathematics. They also had I think they were going to have one of computer science and one of statistics, but it was quite a long time before they found a professor of statistics, but they had 2 professors of mathematics. I was one, and the other was Ralph Smith, the late Ralph Smith.
So you had to create the course from scratch, did you?
We did, yes. It was very exciting because we had to get everything going within a short time, like a year or 2 years or something. Walter Perry wanted us to produce graduates within 2 or 3 years, so that we'd have a lot of graduates there by the time the government decided that the university was a white elephant and should be axed. And this plan worked somehow. I think Mrs. Thatcher was the education minister. Maybe she quite liked the idea of the Open University, I don't know. There was a change of government 2 or 3 years after the OU started up. So we were a bit worried as to what our status would be. But anyway, we were lucky.
So you quite quickly got enough students? doing the course?
Yes, lots and lots of people enrolled. They were all tremendously enthusiastic too, because they were all people who had not, for some reason or other, like not being well enough off, they hadn't been able to go to university, and this was their opportunity. And so the first few years intake was tremendously good people and very, very bright and everything. We had these summer schools, and the students were some of them so enthusiastic. If you just went along, we all stayed in these halls of residence, and if I go along to the bathroom to brush my teeth or something like that, 2 or 3 students would say, "What about this unit so and so? What about your lecture? And tell me about," and so on. So it was great.
But after some years, the course would have become fairly stable, I suppose, and your role would be different, or?
Well, then there were other courses to make. This was the foundation course in mathematics, but then there were other courses, and you had courses were produced by a team of quite a few people, and I was the chairman for a couple of these courses. An interesting thing is that one of the people who was working for me in one of these courses was a chap called Tim O'Shea, a youngster, and he was very frightened of me apparently because I was trying to get them to do something which was almost impossible, namely produce some project work for this mathematics course. Anyway, Tim O'Shea is now the principal of the University of Edinburgh, is he not? So he has gone a long way past me, but that was where we first met, anyway.
And you were involved with the course on nuclear weapons?
Oh yes, well, after I'd done enough mathematics courses, I don't know, I think I wasn't doing any course maybe at that time, but nuclear weapons was a big bone of contention, shall we say, at that time, and some people were thinking of doing a course on that, and they wanted to have a big shot, I suppose, at that level, to be chairman of this course. So we talked about it. The main people were called Margaret Blunden and Janet Radcliffe Richards, a philosopher, who's you might have heard of. She comes on the radio occasionally. And Margaret Blunden is, technologist of social science and technology or something. Anyway, they were both very bright, and they had an idea about this course, which should be treat these things in a rigorous, analytical way instead of getting all excited about whatever you thought was the best way of doing things. So we somehow managed to put together this course called Nuclear Weapons, Inquiry, Analysis and Debate. But the trouble was that as chairman, I had been asked to predict the number of students, and I predicted that it would be 800. I don't know quite how I did that, but I produced some reasoning. But in fact, there were only 200 students. And at the same time, Reagan and Gorbachev ruined the whole thing because they had a meeting in Iceland, I think it was, and they decided they would greatly reduce their arsenals of nuclear weapons. And so I was dead worried. I thought it was going to completely change everything, so our course would be no good anymore. But I understand the American generals persuaded Reagan that he couldn't possibly get rid of so many nuclear weapons. It would be terrible thing to do, so the situation didn't change as much. But even so, because the Soviet Union disappeared, and so the political scene changed a tremendous amount. When it had been seen so static for about 40 years, nothing had changed, and then suddenly everything changed. But by that time I was in Edinburgh, so I was not directly
Yes, so
concerned.
you came to Heriot-Watt in the sort of mid-1980s. I know I had a small role in this. I remember
You had a very big role,
well,
yes. 1986.
suggesting that you would come, and I remember
1986 I came, yes.
I remember people thinking, well, should we appoint somebody who's relatively old?
Yes.
And I was arguing that it would be a great appointment for the university, as indeed it was.
Thank
I
you.
think it was a tremendous
I'm still
successful
relatively
appointment.
old, yes. Well, I don't know. I wasn't aware of that you thought I was very old, but
Well, you were much younger than I am now, of course. But
yes.
but of course, one's perspective is different when one's younger.
Well, it was all different coming here. But I think the Open University had gone rather sort of ossified by then. It seemed to be all committees and nothing was actually happening. And now it's changed again completely since I left. I hardly recognize the place when I go there now. Well, I found it very good coming here to work with you. And Jack Carr, the late Jack Carr. So the three of us wrote a nice paper about metastability, no less, wasn't it? You two did all the mathematics for it.
We wouldn't have worked on the problem at all.
I came up with
if it was not for you.
I came up with a problem, perhaps. Yes.
And soon after you came, you were elected to the Royal Society. So that was now 4 members of the family, right? Was it?
I was, yes. That was just after coming here, which was a surprise, a great surprise to me, I must say.
I don't think it was a surprise to me, but
Oh. There was some kind of a citation which went after me, which was supposed to explain the reasons, my great work for which I had been appointed to this elected to the Royal Society. And I couldn't make much sense of this citation. I said, was that really me who did that stuff? I think it must be somebody else.
But you've had many collaborations since you came to Edinburgh, in fact.
Well, I did a lot of collaborations with Lebowitz too. And I collaborated with John Kahn too. I tried to get him into the Royal Society as a foreign member, but he was not elected, I regret to say. He'd been elected to all sorts of other important things, like in Japan and the National Academy of Sciences of USA and I don't know what. But he said that he was never elected to anything if he knew in advance that he was on the list. And this happened to him too. But John Kahn was a very good materials scientist. He worked at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Washington, D.C. And one of the things he's noted for is Quasi Crystals, which you might have heard of, because there's a chap called Schechtman and some collaborators found this extraordinary crystal, of which I think it was the X-ray pattern had a 10-fold symmetry, and the crystallographers were saying that's impossible. The only symmetries you can have are 6, 4, and 3, or something like that. So Schechtman's paper was not being accepted, and they said, Kahn looked at it and he said, this looks interesting. So they added his name to the list of authors, and then the paper was accepted because of his great kudos. And so it's become very, very respectable now. You have a quasi-crystal sort of thing in your building at Oxford.
Indeed.
On the floor.
Connected with your...
One of Roger's tilings of the plane.
So
which has the same kind of symmetry.
So after a number of years you retired and became a Professor Emeritus, but you still stayed in Edinburgh.
I stayed in Edinburgh, kept on working. Well, I liked it because I didn't have to do any examinations, didn't have to set any examinations. And my students probably liked it because they didn't have to endure my lectures anymore. So
overall, what do you see as being your best piece of work, or the work you're most proud of somehow?
Well, I rather like what I did the very first thing on the liquid helium, which it seems to me I haven't followed it up properly. One of my projects now is to try and follow that up a bit more. Of course, it was all very immature the way I wrote it up. I was foolish enough to put it in a journal that nobody ever reads, for example. Well, generally I didn't mention my book on statistical mechanics.
That's right, yes.
I sort of like that, but it's not been a great success. Although it was brought out as a Dover reprint. So some people must like it. I think the price of second-hand copies before it was brought out by Dover was $200 or something of that kind. But I don't know how much you can read into those prices. Anyway, you can now buy a copy from Dover for, I'm not sure, 10 or 20 pounds or dollars probably.
And what about problems that you've, for many years, maybe tried to solve but couldn't solve, and would like to solve?
Well, I've got a paper. I remember I came along to was it your 60th birthday, or you had a birthday conference here?
Yes. Yeah.
And I gave a talk about showing that you could have a free energy, have the free energy of a crystal consisting of hard disks or hard spheres or something, that you could define the formula for the free energy, which would include elasticity, include the elastic effects. And I gave a talk about it, and I keep trying to write it up, but it gets so complicated that by the time I get to the end of the paper, I can't remember what was at the beginning. So it hasn't been finished yet, that. But perhaps it's more interesting to start on something new than to write up something you have already been trying to write up for a year or so. I also got interested in economics, as you saw me talking to Paul Hare.
Oh, I see, so.
And I thought we could try and get economics treated as a branch of applied mathematics, because, as you will probably remember, in 2008, the predictions made by the economists were totally lunatic. And it's like they were predicting that gross domestic product would go up by something rather, and instead it went shooting down. And in fact, the Queen asked the people at London School of Economics, how is it that you got it so awfully wrong? And I looked at some of the reasoning behind that. So the Bank of England has this model with about 150 variables in it, which is supposed to predict how the economy is doing. And I thought, this is lunatic. How can you possibly have a model with 150 variables? And I'm told that having equations connecting these variables, they don't know what some of the coefficients are, so they just make a guess. So to me, that's not the way to do it. So I thought we could perhaps improve on this, but I've been struggling with it for nearly a decade and haven't we're getting somewhere, but not very far. And whether it will persuade the other economists, even if it ever gets finished, I don't know.
So you've become also, it seems to me, more interested as time has gone on in some of these somewhat philosophical questions, about reversibility and negative temperatures.
Well, I've written too many papers about reversibility. I think that everybody has a different view about it. Lebowitz, for example, is very definite and he writes his stuff about it, and I don't agree with him, and every now and then we have an argument about it. But I wrote a paper about entropy, which arose out of a discussion with you at a Royal Society conference. It was on entropy, wasn't it, that conference at Chicheley Hall, Kavli's Research Centre. And Lebowitz said he agreed with what I said. First of all, he didn't agree, but that was because he thought I was still saying what I had said before. But actually, I was saying something different in this paper. And when he actually got around to reading what I'd said, he thought it was okay, which was very nice. But there's a lot more needs to be understood there. I feel that people get into hot water because they try to explain irreversibility. And I've come round to the idea that science the fundamental thing is not explaining but describing. So if you describe the irreversible behavior in a good way, then you can start trying to explain it. But until you've got a good description, you can't explain anything. You just get into arguments. That little book I showed you, the Anti-Philosophical Dictionary by Peter Knorr, a chap I used to know at Cambridge, became a well-known computer scientist, a Danish astronomer, became a computer scientist. And in this book, by reading his Anti-Philosophical Dictionary, I was persuaded that describing things is the fundamental, and not talking about something is something else. That's another thing he says in his book. Talking about this, something is something else, you're going to get into hot water right away.
So perhaps that's a good place to stop. Thanks very much for telling us all about your career. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, I hope those who hear it will find it interesting.
I'm sure they will.